One Friday evening, I got home later than usual. The office was swamped with deadlines, and I had to stay behind to get a project finished. By the time I walked through the door, it was nearly 8 p.m. I was exhausted, but as I stepped into the house, something felt off. Normally, Isla would greet me with a smile, maybe a drink in her hand, ready to unwind after our day. But tonight, the house was unusually quiet. I called out for her, my voice echoing through the hallway. No answer. I dropped my bag by the door, kicking off my shoes as I made my way into the kitchen. There were no signs of dinner being prepared, which was odd. Isla loved cooking, especially on Fridays when we'd often have friends over or just enjoy a quiet night in. The kitchen was spotless, not a dish out of place, but there was a half-empty glass of wine on the counter. I picked it up, feeling the chill from the glass, meaning she'd been here not too long ago. But where had she gone? I checked my phone looking for a message or a missed call, but there was nothing. Maybe she'd stepped out to get something from the store or went to a friend's place. But she usually let me know if she was going out, especially this late. I wandered into the living room where I noticed something else strange. Her laptop was open on the coffee table, the screen still on. Isla was meticulous about her work, never leaving her computer unattended. I glanced at the screen, seeing an open document with what looked like some design work. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the chat window in the corner, partially obscured but still visible. A name I didn't recognize, Jake, was at the top of the chat. The latest message from him read, "Had a great time earlier, can't wait to do it again." My heart started to race, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the message was clear enough. My mind was spinning with questions. Who the hell was this Jake? What had they done? And why hadn't she mentioned anything about meeting someone today? I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, but it was probably just a few seconds. My first instinct was to close the laptop and pretend I hadn't seen anything. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding, something completely innocent. But the words in that chat kept gnawing at me. I needed to know more. I started scrolling up through the chat, feeling like I was invading her privacy, but I couldn't stop myself. The conversation was flirty, casual at first, then gradually becoming more intimate. My stomach churned as I read through it, my hands gripping the sides of the laptop tighter with every line. It was clear they had met before, at least a few times. The messages hinted at lunch dates, walks in the park, and more. Then I saw it. Plans they had made for today, right around the time I had been stuck in a meeting at work. I heard the front door open, and Isla's voice calling out to me. "Edward, are you home?" She sounded normal, like nothing was out of the ordinary. I quickly shut the laptop, my mind racing to figure out what to say or do next. I was standing in the middle of the living room when she walked in, a grocery bag in hand and a smile on her face. "There you are," she said cheerfully, oblivious to the turmoil I was going through. "I just ran out to get some stuff for dinner. I thought you'd be home a bit later." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, got out a bit earlier than I thought." She walked over and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, then headed into the kitchen to start unpacking the groceries. I followed her, watching as she moved around the kitchen with ease, like nothing was wrong. We had dinner together that night, just like any other night. I asked her about her day, and she told me about some new project she was working on, mentioning a client she had been meeting with regularly. She didn't mention Jake, and I didn't ask. It was like this invisible wall had sprung up between us, one she didn't even know existed. That night, after Isla had fallen asleep, I lay awake in bed, staring at the wall. I kept telling myself that I needed to talk to her, to find out what was really going on. But another part of me was scared of what I might find out. The idea that Isla, the woman I had loved and trusted for so many years, could be hiding something like this from me. It was almost too much to bear. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself forever. That morning after Isla left for work, I decided I couldn't let this sit any longer. I needed to take control of the situation. I didn't want to confront her without having all the facts, but I also couldn't stand the thought of her sneaking around behind my back. So I reached out to one of her colleagues, a woman named Kim, who I knew from the few office parties I'd attended with Isla. Kim was friendly and approachable, and I had a hunch that she might be willing to help me out if I gave her the right incentive. I called her up and got straight to the point, explaining that I had reason to believe Isla was seeing someone behind my back. I told her I needed confirmation and was willing to pay for her help. After a brief pause, she agreed, though I could hear the hesitation in her voice. I assured her that all she needed to do was watch Isla and report back if anything unusual happened. She agreed and we settled on a sum. Later that day, Kim texted me. "Someone came to see her. She's behaving unusually warmly towards him. I think it might be the guy you're worried about." My heart pounded as I read the message, but I kept my cool. I asked her to keep an eye on them until they left and then let me know where they went. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a mix of anger and determination. I took the day off work, not telling Isla about it, and made my way to the park across from her office. I found a bench with a clear view of the entrance and sat down, pretending to read a newspaper. My eyes were fixed on the office building, waiting for her to come out. It wasn't long before I saw her. She walked out of the building, but she wasn't alone. Jake was with her, the same guy from the photos and videos. They stood just outside the entrance, talking closely. I could see Isla smiling, her body language relaxed and open, far too comfortable with him. I kept my face buried in the newspaper, watching them from the corner of my eye. Jake took out his phone, scrolling through something intently. A moment later, Isla did the same. They were both looking for something, and it wasn't hard to guess what it was. They were probably searching for a place where they could be alone, where they could have sex. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to be smart about this. I pulled out my phone and called Isla. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Hey, babe," I said, forcing a tired tone into my voice. "The management's being a pain again. They're dumping everyone's work on me. I'll probably have to stay late tonight, just like last time. I might not be home until 8 p.m., if not later." I heard the slightest hesitation in her voice before she replied, "Oh no, that's terrible. I'm so sorry, Edward. You work so hard. I hope it doesn't take too long." "I'll manage," I said, keeping my voice even. "Don't wait up for me." "Of course, take your time. I love you," she said before hanging up. I watched as she put her phone away, a smile spreading across her face as she turned to Jake. She said something to him and they hugged, both of them looking relieved. They stopped looking at their phones, clearly satisfied with whatever they had planned. I clenched my fists under the newspaper, anger swirling inside me. It was clear now. They had been searching for a place to meet up, and my lie had given them the perfect opportunity. But I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I watched as they walked across the park hand in hand and got into Isla's car. I'd already moved my own car to a different street earlier, anticipating that I might need to make it look like I wasn't home. As they drove off, I stayed put, giving them time to settle into whatever they were planning. After about an hour, I made my way back to the house. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, my heart pounding with anticipation. I approached the front door quietly, slipping the key into the lock as silently as I could. I pushed the door open, the sound of it creaking slightly in the quiet house. I stepped inside, immediately noticing the faint sounds coming from the living room. I moved slowly, quietly, until I could see them through the doorway. There they were on the couch, kissing each other passionately. My blood ran cold at the sight. I didn't catch them having sex, but it was clear what had been about to happen. They hadn't even bothered to go upstairs. I didn't yell, though every instinct in me wanted to. Instead, I just walked into the room, letting my presence speak for itself. The moment they saw me, they froze, fear and shock flashing across their faces. Isla scrambled off the couch, her eyes wide with panic. Jake stood up too, looking like he was about to bolt, but I just stared him down, my eyes locked on his. I always carried a folding knife with me, a habit from my younger days, and for a split second I felt an overwhelming urge to reach for it. But I didn't. Instead, I pointed at Jake, silently commanding him to leave. The look in my eyes must have told him I wasn't messing around because he didn't say a word. He just grabbed his jacket and rushed out of the house. Once he was gone, I turned to Isla. She was standing there, trembling, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. I could see the excuses forming on her lips, but I cut her off before she could say a word. "What the hell was this, Isla?" I asked, my voice low but deadly serious. I wanted answers, and I wasn't going to let her off the hook until I got them. Isla stood there, her face a mix of terror and desperation. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. When she finally did start talking, it all came rushing out at once, a flood of excuses, justifications, and apologies. She stammered through her words, trying to explain, to make me understand. "It's not what it looks like, Edward," she began, her voice shaking. "I swear it just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far. We've been having problems, you know that. You've been so distant, always at work, and I just felt so alone." She went on, talking about how she'd tried to make things work, how she had felt neglected and unloved. She said that Jake was just a distraction, someone who made her feel wanted again, but that it didn't mean anything. She kept insisting that she still loved me, that this was a mistake, something that had spiraled out of control. She started crying, her voice cracking as she begged me to forgive her. She promised that it would never happen again, that she would cut off all contact with Jake, and that she'd do whatever it took to make things right between us. She said she was willing to go to therapy, to do anything if it meant saving our marriage. But as she continued to talk, justifying herself over and over, I stood there in silence. My face remained expressionless, my mind cold and detached. I didn't need to say anything. Her frantic explanations only solidified what I already knew. This wasn't something that could be fixed with apologies or promises. The damage was done, and there was no going back. She kept talking, pleading with me, saying that we could get through this, that our love was stronger than this mistake. But I could see through her words. It wasn't love that had driven her into another man's arms. It was something else, something that had been festering between us for longer than I cared to admit. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of listening to her desperate attempts to salvage the situation, I spoke. My voice was calm, devoid of any emotion. "It's over, Isla," I said, each word deliberate and final. "There's nothing left between us now." She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the weight of my words hit her. I could see the realization dawning in her eyes, the understanding that this wasn't just a fight, that this wasn't something we could come back from. I took a step closer, looking directly into her tear-streaked face. "You didn't have respect for me all this time, but show it now, at least until we're divorced. Don't meet with anyone else." Her eyes widened, and before I could react, she lunged towards me, screaming my name. She reached out to hug me, calling me dear, in a desperate plea for some kind of reconciliation. But I wasn't having it. I reacted on pure instinct, shoving her back with both hands. She stumbled, losing her balance, and fell backward onto the sofa. She looked up at me, shocked and hurt, but I didn't feel anything for her in that moment. Not pity, not anger, nothing. I was done. "I need to be alone now," I said, my voice still cold and controlled. "Don't even think about coming with me." Without waiting for her response, I turned and walked out of the living room, leaving her there on the couch, alone with the wreckage of what was once our marriage. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, I might see something in her eyes that would make me hesitate, and I couldn't afford that. After leaving Isla alone in the house, I knew I needed to take the next step. This marriage was over, and there was no point in dragging it out. I grabbed my phone and called Joe, my oldest friend. We'd been through a lot together, and it just so happened that Joe was a lawyer, a damn good one. When he picked up, I got straight to the point. "Joe, I need your help. I'm filing for divorce." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before he responded. "Edward, are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. "Can you help me with the paperwork?" "Of course," he replied. "Come by my office and we'll get started." I hung up, not feeling any relief, just a grim sense of resolve. I drove straight to Joe's office, trying to keep my thoughts focused on what needed to be done. The drive felt like it took forever, though it was probably only about 20 minutes. When I got there, Joe was waiting for me. We didn't waste any time on small talk. He could see in my face that I wasn't in the mood for it. We sat down in his office and he began walking me through the process. Joe was thorough, as always, explaining everything I needed to know about the legal side of things, how to divide assets, what to expect with the paperwork. the timeline for the divorce to be finalized. I barely said a word, just nodded along as he laid out the steps. He could tell I wasn't in the mood to discuss anything beyond the legalities, and I appreciated that he didn't push for details. After we finished, I left Joe's office feeling like I was moving through a fog. The weight of what was happening, of what I was putting into motion, was starting to settle in. I walked around the city for hours, my mind replaying everything that had happened over the past few days. The betrayal, the lies, the cold reality of what Isla had done. It all felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else. By the time I got home that evening, it was dark. Isla was there, sitting on the couch, looking like she hadn't moved since I left. We didn't exchange a single word. I wasn't ready to talk, and I could tell she didn't know what to say either. I walked past her without a glance and headed to the living room, where I turned on the TV, hoping to drown out my thoughts with the noise. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The next day at work, I went through the motions, trying to keep my mind off everything that had happened. It wasn't easy. Every time I looked up from my desk, I saw the image of Isla and Jake together, and it made me sick. By the time lunch rolled around, I was feeling like I needed a break. I stepped outside to get some air, and that's when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered anyway, hoping it was just a work call. Instead, I heard a voice I never expected. Jake. "Edward, it's Jake. I need to talk to you." "What the hell do you want?" I snapped, my anger flaring up immediately. "Listen, man, I know you have every reason to hate me, but this is important. There's something you need to know about Isla. She has another secret." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Another secret? What are you talking about?" Jake hesitated, and I could hear him taking a deep breath on the other end of the line. "Can we meet? It's better if I tell you in person." "Fine," I said, not hiding my annoyance. "There's a cafe near my office. Meet me there in 30 minutes. I hung up and tried to wrap my head around what Jake could possibly have to tell me. Another secret? I didn't know what to expect, but I had to find out. I arrived at the cafe first and took a seat near the back, where I could see anyone coming in. I didn't have to wait long. Jake walked in, looking around nervously before spotting me. He approached the table cautiously, probably sensing the anger radiating off me. He sat down across from me, keeping his hands in plain sight like he was afraid I might lash out. "All right, Jake, spill it. What's this other secret?" I asked, my voice cold and sharp. Jake glanced around the cafe as if making sure no one was listening. Then he leaned in slightly and said, "Isla, she's been seeing someone else, another guy." My expression didn't change, but inside I felt a fresh wave of anger. "You mean to tell me she's been cheating on you too?" Jake nodded, looking a bit uncomfortable. "Yeah, I guess so. I didn't know at first, but a few times when I passed by her work, I saw her leaving with this other guy. She was acting the same way she did with me, laughing, smiling, touching his arm like they were together. It was pretty clear they were more than just friends." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what he was saying. "And you're sure about this? You're sure it wasn't just business or something innocent?" Jake shook his head. "No, this was different. This guy, he didn't seem like he had a lot of money, but there was something about him. Isla seemed more excited around him, more alive. I hate to admit it, but it seemed like she was more into him than she ever was with me." I stared at Jake, trying to gauge whether he was telling the truth or just trying to mess with me. But his face was earnest, and there was a hint of bitterness in his voice that told me he wasn't lying. I didn't say anything for a moment, just kept looking at him with a fierce intensity. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wary of what I might do next. "So let me get this straight," I said finally. "You're telling me Isla was cheating on you with some other guy too?" Jake nodded, a resigned look on his face. "Yeah, I thought you should know. I don't know who this other guy is, but I figured you deserved to know the truth." For a moment we just sat there in silence, the weight of what he'd told me settling in. I felt a mix of anger and something else, something that felt like a sick kind of relief. Isla had not only betrayed me, but had also betrayed the man she was cheating on me with. The irony of it all was almost too much to bear. "Thanks for telling me," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "But don't expect any sympathy from me. You're just as guilty in all of this." Jake nodded again, not arguing. "I know. I'm sorry, Edward. I really am." I didn't respond. Instead, I just got up and walked out of the cafe, leaving Jake sitting there alone. I had all the confirmation I needed. Isla was even more deceitful than I had thought. And now there was no doubt in my mind that I had made the right decision to end our marriage. Over the next few days, I focused on preparing the divorce documents with Joe. But even as the paperwork came together, I found myself hesitating to take the final step. Part of me wanted to see what Isla would do next. Would she go back to her old ways, or had the confrontation with Jake scared her enough to make her change? Jake's words kept replaying in my mind. He had said Isla was much more involved with this other guy, someone who wasn't as wealthy but had captured her attention in a way that Jake never could. According to Jake, Isla was hooked on the emotions this man gave her, the excitement that came with being with someone so different from what she was used to. It made me sick to think that she could be so easily swayed, but I needed to know for sure before I made any final decisions. One evening, Isla and I were sitting in the living room, the atmosphere between us strangely calm considering everything that had happened. She had been on her best behavior since the confrontation, acting as though she was trying to win me back. There was a desperation in her that hadn't been there before, like she was afraid of losing me for good. I could tell she was testing the waters, trying to see if there was any chance of reconciliation. "Edward," she asked tentatively, "do you think there's any hope for us? Can I still believe that you might forgive me someday?" Her question hung in the air, and I knew this was a pivotal moment. I could end it all right here, or I could push things a little further, see where her loyalty really lay. I decided to take the latter route. "Isla," I said slowly, my tone measured, "you've caused me a lot of pain. What you did, it's not something I can just forget. But maybe people deserve a second chance." The words felt heavy in my mouth, but I knew they would have the desired effect. Isla's eyes widened, and before I knew it, she had thrown herself at me, wrapping her arms around me in a tight hug. She kissed me on the cheek, tears in her eyes as she thanked me over and over, telling me how much she loved me, how she would do anything to make things right. I barely managed to smile in return, my thoughts already elsewhere. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I needed to know if Jake's warning about the other man was true or just another layer of deception. That night after Isla had gone to bed, I made another call to Kim. She had been helpful before, and I figured she might be able to give me some insight into what was going on at Isla's office. I offered her more money to watch Isla again to see if there was any sign of this other man. Kim agreed, and I waited anxiously for her report. A few days later, Kim called me back. "Edward, I've been keeping an eye on Isla like you asked, but there's been nothing unusual. Jake hasn't shown up again, and there haven't been any other suspicious clients either. She's just been going to work, doing her job, and heading home." I thanked her and hung up, feeling more confused than ever. If there really was another man, why hadn't he made an appearance? Maybe Jake had lied to me, trying to stir up more trouble out of spite. But something in Jake's eyes during our meeting had told me he wasn't lying. He seemed genuinely bitter, like a man who had been betrayed himself. This uncertainty dragged on for a couple of weeks. During that time, Isla seemed to believe that I was softening, that perhaps I was on the verge of forgiving her. We went back to our old routines, doing things together as if nothing had happened. She even started making plans for us, like a weekend getaway outside the city. She suggested we spend the night at a little bed and breakfast we used to go to, a place full of good memories. During that weekend trip, Isla tried to rekindle the physical side of our relationship. She kept hinting at it, and then one night she came right out and asked me to sleep with her. I could see the hope in her eyes, the way she was trying to make everything feel normal again, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. "I'm not ready, Isla," I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "The bitterness of your betrayal, it hasn't passed yet." She looked hurt, but she didn't push. Instead, she hugged me tightly, burying her face in my chest. "I'm so sorry, Edward. I'll never hurt you again, I promise. I just want us to be happy together." She apologized over and over, whispering that she loved me, that she would do anything to make up for what she had done. I stayed quiet, my arms around her, but my mind was elsewhere. Each day I woke up wondering if today would be the day I discovered the final piece of the puzzle. But the days passed, and nothing happened. Isla continued to act as if we were on the road to reconciliation, while I kept my guard up, waiting for the other shoe to drop. For a while, things settled into an uncomfortable routine. Isla seemed to believe that I was gradually coming around, that I was softening and maybe even on the path to forgiving her. She returned to her old self, cooking meals, chatting with me about our day, even occasionally hinting at getting intimate again. I won't lie. There were moments when I found myself wanting to give in, to make love to her like we used to recapture some of what we'd lost. But every time the thought crossed my mind, I pushed it away. I needed to stay vigilant. Then one evening, everything changed. We were in bed, Isla lying next to me, seemingly relaxed, confident that our lives were returning to normal. She left her phone on the nightstand and went to take a shower. Normally, she'd take it with her, but tonight she was careless, or perhaps she was just so sure of her standing that she didn't think she needed to hide anything anymore. I tried to ignore it at first, but curiosity and the lingering suspicion got the better of me. I picked up her phone and unlocked it, scrolling through her messages. I saw the old conversation with Jake, the one that had ended abruptly after I caught them. But then I found something else, a message thread with someone named Eric. Eric wasn't a name I recognized, and from the photos in their chat, I saw he had slightly dark skin. As I started reading, I quickly realized this was the man Jake had warned me about, the one who had Isla hooked not on money, but on something far more dangerous to our marriage. My heart pounded as I scrolled through their recent exchanges. The messages were explicit, full of innuendos and outright declarations of desire. Isla had been texting him today just before she went to bed with me. One particular message from him made my stomach turn. He had sent her an audio clip boasting about how he was going to fuck her so hard she wouldn't be able to walk for a whole day. He called Jake and me fools, bragging about how easily he had captivated her. It was sickening. I kept reading, my hands shaking. From the messages, I learned that Eric wasn't wealthy. He was self-employed, hustling to make ends meet. But it was clear his personality, his confidence, excited Isla in a way that nothing else did. Despite the threat of divorce, despite everything, she kept seeing him. She couldn't resist him, even after I had given her a chance to fix things between us. I was stunned, even though part of me had suspected something like this all along. I wanted to catch her in the act, just like I had with Jake, but I didn't know when or where they were meeting. It seemed like they weren't seeing each other at work, which made things more complicated. The next day I went to work as usual, but my mind was elsewhere. I was determined to catch them, to end this once and for all. After handling a few urgent tasks, I was getting ready to head home when my phone rang. It was Kim. "Edward," she said, her voice tense. "I just saw Isla leaving the office. A dark-skinned man approached her, and they hugged. I think this is the guy you were worried about." My heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. Anything could happen now, and if Isla went to his place, I might not be able to track them down. I needed them to go to our house where I could catch them in the act. I quickly formulated a plan. If I called Isla and told her I was staying late at work again, it might give her the opportunity to bring Eric home. But this time, I needed to make it more convincing. I called my colleague Carlos, who sat near me at work, and asked him for a favor. I needed him to shout something in the background to make it sound like I was really stuck at the office. Carlos didn't ask questions. He just agreed to help. I called Isla, my heart racing. When she answered, I put the plan into action. "Hey, Isla," I said, sounding frustrated. "I'm sorry, but I've been forced to stay late again. They're piling on the work, and I won't be home until late tonight." Right on cue, Carlos shouted from across the room. "Edward, get back to work if you want to leave today. Stop chatting on the phone." I made a show of sighing heavily. "Did you hear that? I better get back to it. I'm really sorry. I'll be home as soon as I can." Isla's voice was sympathetic, just like before. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Edward. You work so hard. Take care, okay? I'll see you when you get home." We hung up and I sat there waiting. I didn't know if it would work, but I didn't have any other options. I hoped they would want to diversify their intimacy and go to our house. I needed to catch them to put an end to this once and for all. A little while later, I made my way back home, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I noticed a car parked nearby that I didn't recognize. It had to be his. I parked a little further down the street and walked the rest of the way, my mind racing with thoughts of what I might find inside. But as I approached the house, I hesitated. What if they weren't there? What if this was just another dead end? I shook the doubts out of my head and took a deep breath. I had come too far to turn back now. I pushed the door open and stepped inside the bedroom. The first thing I heard were the unmistakable sounds of Isla's moans, echoing through the dimly lit room. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the bed, the sight before me both confirming my worst fears and filling me with a cold, controlled rage. Isla was lying on her back, completely naked, her body arching with pleasure as she moaned. Her eyes were closed, oblivious to everything except what Eric was doing to her. He was kneeling at the foot of the bed, his hands between her legs, playing with her intimately, his face focused on the task. He hadn't even noticed me yet. I stood there, watching them for a moment, the scene burning itself into my mind. Then, just like I had done with Jake, I stepped closer, making my presence known. My eyes locked onto Isla first and then shifted to Eric. The realization hit Isla like a bucket of cold water. Her eyes flew open, her body stiffening in shock. She scrambled to pull the sheets over herself, terror flashing across her face. Eric, however, was calm. Too calm. He hadn't fully undressed yet, unlike Isla. He turned his head to look at me, his expression unreadable, but with a hint of arrogance that made my blood boil. "Don't you want to tell me anything?" I asked, my voice cold and steady, the words dripping with venom. Eric met my gaze and after a moment smiled sarcastically. "No, I don't want to," he said, the smirk on his face making it clear he had no respect for me or the situation. He was enjoying this. My temper flared and I pointed to the door. "Get out," I growled, my tone deadly serious. "Or else." Eric's smile only widened. He got up from the bed, still wearing his shorts, and said, "Or else what? You'll do something to me? Relax, man. I can calm your darling down, and we'll just go back to enjoying ourselves. How about that?" Something inside me snapped. I couldn't hold back any longer. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my folding knife, flipping the blade open with a swift motion as I started walking toward him. My intention wasn't clear even to myself, whether I wanted to scare him or actually do something more. My mind was a blur of rage and adrenaline. Eric's smirk vanished instantly. His eyes widened in genuine fear as he realized I wasn't bluffing. Without another word, he bolted for the window, scrambling to open it. In his panic, he didn't even bother trying to fight back or argue. He just jumped, crashing through the open window and landing outside with a thud. The drop wasn't high and he quickly scrambled to his feet, but not before leaving behind his shoes and outerwear. He ran off in nothing but his shorts, fleeing down the street in terror. Isla, still in shock, looked from the window to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Edward," she stammered, Did you just try to stab him?" I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. The expression on my face told her everything she needed to know. "Are you going to make me go to jail because of this jerk?" I finally said, my voice flat and emotionless. "No." The words were clipped, final. Without another word, I reached into my bag and pulled out the divorce papers I had prepared with Joe. I held them out to her, my gaze cold and unforgiving. "This is what you deserve. Sign them, right now." Isla was still in shock, too stunned to argue or resist. I could see the gears turning in her head, but before she could fully process what was happening, she took the papers with trembling hands. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I didn't waver. I didn't let her see any sign of weakness. I played on her emotions, kept her off balance while she was still reeling from what had just happened. She fumbled for a pen, her hands shaking as she scribbled her name on the dotted line. She signed everything, all of it, without a single word of protest. The shock of the situation had completely overpowered her, leaving her no room to object or think clearly. As soon as she finished, I took the papers from her, folded them neatly, and put them away. It was over. Isla was left sitting there, naked and trembling, her world crumbling around her. The house we had lived in originally belonged to Isla. I had moved in with her almost immediately after we met. My roots, however, were in a small town in Maine. I hadn't been back there in years, not since my parents had moved away, but now it seemed like the only place I could go. I didn't argue when it came time to leave. After the divorce was finalized, I packed my things and left the city without looking back. There was nothing left for me there, nothing but painful memories and the ruins of a marriage that had once seemed so full of promise. When I arrived back in that small town in Maine, it felt both familiar and foreign. The house my parents had left behind was empty, but it was still standing. I moved in, needing the solitude, the distance from everything that had happened. The old folks in town remembered me immediately, unlike the younger ones who didn't know me at all. They greeted me with kind words and curiosity, but I wasn't in the mood for small talk. The town was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just escaped. But the quiet didn't bother me. In fact, it was exactly what I needed. I didn't keep in touch with Isla, and I had no interest in knowing what was happening in her life. For me, that chapter was closed. I had a new job in a similar company to the one I'd left behind, and the days passed in relative peace. The solitude gave me the space I needed to heal, and the town's simplicity provided a kind of comfort I hadn't realized I was missing. One day, a few months after I had settled into my new routine, I had to return to the city to pick up some paperwork from my old job. It was a brief trip, just in and out, and I didn't plan on lingering. I drove through familiar streets, avoiding places that might bring up unwanted memories. But as fate would have it, I ended up driving past the house I had once called home. I hadn't planned on stopping, but something made me slow down. The driveway was empty, no sign of Isla's car. But as I glanced toward the front door, I saw someone I recognized all too well, Eric. He was stepping out of a taxi, a cocky grin on his face. And behind him, two young women emerged, one with black hair, the other with light brown. Both were dressed provocatively, their laughter echoing down the street as they followed Eric into the house. I didn't stick around to see more. It was none of my business anymore. I drove on, heading straight to my old office. The whole thing left a sour taste in my mouth, but I reminded myself that Isla had made her choices. She had married Eric after I left, according to what I'd heard. Now she was living with him in the house we once shared. If she was happy with that, or if she was just pretending, it didn't matter to me. After I picked up the papers from work, I stepped out into the cool afternoon air, ready to head back to Maine. But as I walked down the street, I spotted a familiar face, Kim. She was walking toward me, and at first she didn't recognize me. I had changed my haircut, grown a beard, and the months of distance had left their mark on me. But when our eyes met, she stopped and did a double take. "Edward, is that you?" she asked, her voice full of surprise. "Yeah, it's me," I replied, smiling slightly. "Been a while." We stood there for a moment, just taking in the sight of each other. I'd always seen Kim as just Isla's colleague, someone I had only interacted with out of necessity. But now, standing there on the street, she looked different to me. She was 4 years older than Isla, but looked 5 years younger. There was a vibrancy about her that I hadn't noticed before. I didn't know if she had someone in her life, maybe a husband, a boyfriend, but at that moment, it didn't seem to matter. "You know," I said, "I was just about to grab a coffee. Want to join me? We could catch up." Kim smiled warmly, and without hesitation she agreed. We walked to a nearby cafe, one I used to frequent, and sat down to talk. It was strange how natural it felt, as if we'd done this 100 times before. As we talked, Kim opened up about what had been happening since I left. She told me that Isla had married Eric not long after I moved to Maine. They were living in our old house now, but things weren't as perfect as they might seem. According to Kim, Eric regularly brought other women into the house, and Isla either pretended not to notice or simply didn't care. It was a far cry from the life we had once shared, but it seemed like Isla was content with it, or maybe she was just putting on a brave face. As we talked, I realized that Kim had a lot more going on beneath the surface than I'd ever known. She was sharp, funny, and surprisingly easy to talk to. She gave me a seductive, almost teasing look as she mentioned how she'd always wanted to experience life in a place like Maine. "I've lived here my whole life," she said, her voice soft and inviting. "I'd love to have new experiences in a new state, with a new person. Her words hung in the air and I couldn't help but smile. Well, I replied, I'd be happy to organize that for you. It's quiet, beautiful, perfect for a fresh start. Kim's eyes sparkled with interest. I can't wait, she said, her tone filled with anticipation. We sat there for a while longer, chatting about everything and nothing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of excitement about what the future might hold. As I drove back to Maine, my mind was already racing with ideas. I began planning trips around the area, thinking about all the places I could show her. Despite growing up there, I realized there was so much I hadn't explored, so much I could now discover with Kim. I started spending my free time organizing our potential travels, regularly calling Kim to get her input on where she'd like to go. Each conversation brought us closer, and I could feel the beginning of something new taking shape, something that felt right in a way that nothing had in a long time. It was clear that life in Maine was about to get a lot more interesting.